Okay, there we go. Okay, let me go back to the clip here. And I would say that I just want to mention about Mike. If you want to watch the debate with Larry Shapiro here, this is at Ohio State University. I was there. We kind of co-hosted that. You can watch that online. Mike has also debated Bart Ehrman, as we mentioned last time, several times. Those are all online. I think is it 3 or 4 times at least he's debated Bart, and so he's very familiar with his work. And Bart's very popular. So if you want to watch some of those, that's good stuff. You can watch those online. They're all able to be viewed. All right. So having said that, you know all about Dr. Licona, and you can go deeper on some of his materials if you want to. But tonight, we want to talk about the Gospels. Last time I talked about Bart Ehrman and what it was like to debate him, and Mike answered a bunch of questions about that. But tonight we are talking specifically about the Gospels, and I know Mike has done a lot of research on that. So I have about 6, 7 questions for Mike, and then we can take some Q&A from other people, some things that come up in discussions about the Gospels. I know Mike's familiar with these, but I just want to mention some of these questions, and then we can go from there after that. So first of all, Mike, when we're talking to people about the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it seems that when you're talking to people and they talk about evidence, lack of evidence for Jesus, trying to use the Gospels, that sometimes they confuse the difference between circumstantial and direct evidence. Now, I don't know if you use that terminology in your debates, like we talk about circumstantial evidence. I know you have a lot of tests for historicity you use and the explanatory power and all that stuff, but do you think that this is a good approach when we talk to people? I mean, we can't carve out a direct evidential case for Jesus because we weren't there to witness any of it directly. So do you think like using terminology like circumstantial evidence makes sense, or do you use something else? You talk about the life of Jesus.
I don't know. There's so many different ways to put it, Eric. I would use probably primary versus secondary sources. But if you want to do it that way, direct evidence, we don't have any people who are alive today who we can cross-examine and hear from them directly. Of course, we don't have that for anything from that period. We don't have Caesar Augustus or any of the eyewitnesses whom we can talk to personally. Now, of course, we can say we've got some direct evidence, if we take the traditional authorship of Matthew and John, since they would have been eyewitnesses. But, those are disputed. The authorship of those is disputed even amongst today's scholars, even some evangelical scholars. So, for example, Ben Witherington thinks that the Gospel of John was not written by John, but Lazarus. And there's actually some decent evidence for that. The reason I don't take it is because nobody in antiquity attributed it to Lazarus, but otherwise there's some decent internal evidence that would point to Lazarus. Matthew, there's, it's a thorny issue when it comes to the authorship of Matthew. We can get into that if you want. So
we have that as a question.
But direct evidence, we don't have direct evidence in so far as the way you're defining it here. We don't have direct evidence for anything like that. In fact, we don't have any direct evidence for World War I or the American Civil War in that sort of a sense.
Right. Okay.
Or I guess you could say we do for some of those. We have some photographs.
Right. I had heard, I know you debated, let me tie this in with one thing, one guy you debated Matt Dillahunty a ways back. And I had heard that he doesn't accept any, somebody's sound's on. He does not accept any circumstantial evidence. And I found that to be weird. I'm like, well, how are you going to debate the resurrection if you don't accept any circumstantial evidence? You know what I mean? I don't know if that's true or not, but I'd seen that somewhere. You debated him, so I don't know if that came up, but does that come up with some guys you debate or ever?
I haven't heard those terms before, direct versus circumstantial. I haven't heard it put that way.
Okay.
But the way that you're talking about it there, I mean, if you define it as circumstantial, that, if you're going to say the Gospels are circumstantial evidence and anything we have, any records, I mean, the same would apply to all ancient literature. So, I mean, when we're talking, if we want to learn about Caesar Augustus or Julius Caesar, Tiberius Caesar, or any of these people from the past, that's the way it's going to be. Everything's going to be circumstantial as you're defining it there.
Okay, that's fine then. I think we're good on that. When you get challenged on whether the Gospels are historically reliable, I also find this to be kind of a issue of terminology. I mean, defining what what we mean. Like what do we mean by historically reliable? And I always say, that, I always ask them, what do you mean by that? Would you say that if you kind of go down a list here, these are some of the things we mean when we say historically reliable, and people are asking that, does it have to do with whether the places are factual and the people are factual, or whether the text has been transmitted accurately, or whether we can trust the witnesses or the miraculous events? I mean, do you ever try to define that, or do you think that that covers a broad range of things when you say like historically reliable?
Yeah, in fact, I do try to. It's not as simple a question as one would think, and what makes it a little muddy is that ancient historians and biographers did not have the same um, conventions for writing history and biography as we have today. Even Craig Blomberg, a very conservative New Testament scholar, evangelical, says, we're not to confuse ancient biography with modern biography. They operated by some different rules for writing. Um, they weren't so much concerned with the kind of precision and accuracy that we are today. They were writing, in the words of Plutarch, the great ancient biographer, they were writing literary portraits. And just as portraits today, like there's a portrait of George Washington. He's standing there, he's got a hand on his hip, and you see fighting going on in the background and a cannonball by his foot. Well, of course, this isn't a photograph. This isn't the way it really happened. It's not like he's posing for a portrait while there's fighting going on in the background. Incoming! That's
Right.
not going to happen that way. So, but the fighting in the background is uh, to give the viewer, recollections of various battles in which Washington was involved and weapons like the cannonball. Um, so uh, I don't want to press that analogy too far, but the ancients would take liberties sometimes in reporting the details. So um, we would expect, we shouldn't be surprised if we see the gospel authors doing the same thing at times. In fact, we should be surprised if they don't. So when we're talking about historically reliable, how do we define it? I think you've given some criteria here, but you haven't given a definition. What I would say defining historically reliable would be, um, in terms of ancient historiography, is that it provides an accurate gist or an essentially faithful representation of what occurred. That's how I
Okay.
would define historically reliable. And then you could talk about criteria such as you've listed here, and then I would provide some others as well.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I hear that a lot. It seems like they're just not defining what they mean. I would agree. You have to judge it by the ancient. We're not we're moderns trying to understand it, so you definitely have to go by, the ancient conventions.
Yeah,
Okay.
if you want to hear just a short dialogue between Bart Ehrman and me on that, year and a half ago, we had a conference in which Kurt Jarris
Yeah,
put it on,
I
Defenders
saw it.
Media.
Hmm.
Um, Up in Chicago. And so we each gave lectures and then had a panel discussion. And Bart and I went back and forth a little bit on the meaning of historically reliable. And, could we call the Gospels reliable under that definition? He thought it was a meaningless definition because people don't understand reliable in that sense today. And I said, well, Bart, here's the problem. Most people don't really think in historical terms today. They don't think deeply about these things and I said, like you and I do, Bart. And I said, but here's the problem. If you're going to say the Gospels are historically unreliable because you're going to do it by today's literary conventions, then you're going to have to say that all ancient historiography is historically unreliable. And that is going to give a false, and he said, that's right. And I said, well, see, the problem with that, Bart, is that's going to give a false impression to the average person because now they're going to get the impression that we can't know but very, very little about the past, and that would be false. He said, yeah, that would be false. And I said, so I think it's best just to define historically reliable according to the conventions in play at the time of writing, explain what we mean by that. I think that's a much better way to do it and why we mean it that way.
Okay. But doesn't he kind of do that? Doesn't he kind of take like a very modern expectation and place it on the Gospels, like an overly modern expectation? Or
Absolutely. And he
okay,
acknowledges that the gospel authors use these compositional devices that I speak about in one of my books. Um, he acknowledges that that went on. I mean, it's hard to deny it, actually, um, but then he turns around and in order to get out of it so that he can maintain that the gospels are not historically reliable, when challenged, he has to admit that all ancient literature is unreliable. So
by
that
his
gives a
standards,
false
right?
impression.
Right, right. Yeah, it's just he's inconsistent. So I know you haven't gone back and forth with him at all. So you can watch those debates.
No, I like Bart. I mean, we've become
Yeah.
friends, actually.
Oh,
And
I know.
even after
Hmm.
that, he invited me to contribute 3 blogs to his own blog. So yeah, we become friends, and I appreciate his pushing back, and I push back at him, and we do it in a collegial, respectful manner.
Right.
He's just wrong.
Right. He's got his little following there. Okay, let's talk about this issue of oral tradition, oral memory. So let me go to this next kind of weird timeline slide. So, people give the dates of the Gospels. I know some dates are debated and everything on all these. I know you know this better than anybody, but the point is that before the written aspect happens, there's an oral layer. And there was a guy named, you probably remember Maurice Casey. He passed away, I don't know, 5, 6 years, maybe 4 or 5
Not that
years
long
ago.
ago. Yeah,
Not
probably
that long ago, 3 or 4 years ago.
probably three
I don't
years
know,
ago, something
3
like
years
that.
ago. So, he had this book where he was against Jesus mythicism. He thought people didn't believe Jesus existed was ridiculous. And it is ridiculous. But he wrote this book. And he said this in his book. I have a quote. He says, Jesus of Nazareth left no literary works at all, and he had no reason to write any. He lived in a primarily oral culture, except for the sanctity and central importance of its sacred texts, which approximate their Hebrew Bible. Almost all of our surviving primary sources about Jesus are written by his followers, because most people who had any interest in writing about him were his followers, and a few relatively early comments by him were such as Josephus and Tacitus are largely due to special circumstances, such as Jesus' brother Jacob. So, he's basically saying, obviously, everything was oral. Jesus didn't write anything down. And oral tradition, people think of it, something that's passed down from a generation to the next. Oral history, you ask the eyewitness for those who were there, for the recollections, things like that. So the point is that the Jesus story was first orally transmitted. And how much do you think we can really, despite all the books I have on my shelf about it, how much do we really know about that oral phase? We can't get a video recording of it. People say, well, it was transmitted this way or that way, it was fixed, it was loose, it was this, it was that. But how much can we really know about it? I think it's kind of speculative. What do you think? A
Yeah,
little speculative.
that's a good question. There is speculation, and there's different ways of looking at it. You have Kenneth Bailey, who taught one way, that a certain way of doing it, how they do it in the Middle East today. But of course, the problem with that is what's done in the Middle East today in oral cultures. That doesn't mean it was done that way 2,000 years ago. Then
Right.
you can go back to Birger Gerhardsen in the early 1960s, where he talked about more of a rabbinic way of transmitting oral tradition, a very, controlled method. And the problem is that, that's second century and third century. And even though it's closer than the 20th and 21st century to Jesus' day, it's still a century or more removed from Jesus. So we don't know that that's the case. And in fact, when we look at the Gospels, we find that it's not the case, because they do differ from one another. And the rabbinic tradition would have been more of a word for word kind of thing. That's not what we have in the Gospels. And anybody just comparing parallel accounts can see that there are differences. So it's not the rabbinic sense, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be somewhat close to that. Um, what we do know, we do have a few examples, like with the Eucharist sayings. You find it in Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where he has on the night Jesus was betrayed, and then he gives the Eucharist sayings, this is my body, which is broken for you. This cup is the blood which is shed for the new covenant. And then what you do is you go to the Gospels. Now, John doesn't record these things because in John, the Last Supper John isn't trying to tell us that it's on the Passover. But you've got Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's definitely on the Passover that this meal is occurring. And you got Matthew and Mark, they have Jesus with the Eucharist sayings, and then you have Luke. Well, if you compare Luke's sayings, which differ a little bit from Matthew and Mark are almost verbatim, but Luke's saying is almost verbatim with what we have from Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, which shows you there's a little bit different in the oral traditions that are being passed down. The gist is the same, okay? You still get the gist of what's going on. They're both essentially faithful representations. They don't contradict one another. The details are very similar. But in terms of verbatim, Matthew and Mark are almost verbatim. Luke and Paul are almost verbatim. What that shows you is these oral traditions are formulated and passed along, and they are passed along with fair accuracy, because Paul's writing 1 Corinthians around the mid-50s. Luke has been dated differently, but if you want to date Luke, some the earliest dating are putting them in the late 50s. Even in that sense, you're looking at probably at least 5 years after Paul, and it's virtually word for word. Most scholars today are dating Luke probably somewhere in the 70s and 80s. So you could have up to 35 years, 30 years difference between 1 Corinthians and the Gospel of Luke. And the further or later you date Luke, the more impressive the integrity being preserved of the oral tradition becomes, because here you have it 30 years later and it's still virtually word for word. So you can see some of this oral tradition that has been preserved. We also know that Paul put a high premium on tradition when he's talking, and I think it's 1 Corinthians and 2 Thessalonians, I believe it is. He's saying to hold firmly to the tradition that he had passed on to them. And if someone didn't hold to that tradition, then those people weren't even to eat with such a person who wasn't holding to the tradition. So, this is stuff that was passed along very carefully. We can also see Paul in 1 Corinthians, chapter 7, where he's talking about marriage and divorce. And this is where he says, they ask him 3 questions. 1, can we get married? And he says, sure, it's better if you don't, given the persecution that's going on these days. But, so if you can remain single as I've remained single, Paul says, that's great. But if you're going to be too tempted sexually, then you should get married. And he says, this is my opinion. And then he talks about divorce. Well, Paul, is it okay to get divorced? And then he says that statement, not I, but the Lord. Okay. Now, what does this mean? Does this mean that, it's not the red letter edition or something? What's going on? You don't have to listen to the first one. No, he's saying, this isn't my opinion any longer. This is a tradition I've received from Jesus. And he pretty much gives the same thing. If you're married to someone, you got to stay married to them unless they are sexually unfaithful. And then you're free to divorce. Well, Paul, what if I'm married to a non-believer? And then he makes this statement, not the Lord, but I. Well, does that mean this isn't inspired? Does it mean it's not the red letter? What's going on here? Well, Paul's just saying Jesus didn't speak about this. I don't have any Jesus tradition on this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an apostolic command. And that is, if you're married to an unbeliever and they want to remain married, you remain married to them. But if they want to divorce, then you're free to divorce them and you can remarry as long as it's with a fellow believer. And he says, this is my command, just pass it along in the churches. So it's apostolic authority that needs to be obeyed. But what Paul was careful to do was not commingle the Jesus tradition with his own opinions, which gives you an idea that they are being very careful to maintain the integrity of the Jesus tradition. I could go on about this, but it's like this Jesus tradition. You've got these things, and the church was headquartered in Jerusalem, and decisions made by the Jerusalem church were binding on the churches outside the city, and it was an authority to which even Paul submitted. So, yeah, they were very careful about the Jesus tradition. When it comes to the Gospels, just one final thought here. When it comes to the Gospels, what do we have in them? Do we have tradition that had been corrupted over time? I don't think so. Now, there can be no question that there were traditions about Jesus that got corrupted, stories about Jesus that were invented. We read about these things in some of the non-canonical Gospels, like the infancy Gospel of Thomas, etc. That doesn't mean it's in the canonical Gospels. What we have there, I think, is far more reliable. And we can know this because Matthew and Luke are preserving Mark and doing very little editing of Mark. And I think this is because they know where Mark gets it from, where he gets his information.
Is there are there any scholars that deny, I think I asked you this once a long time ago, do they deny like an oral phase? Like they think it's just like written down, like boom, like Jesus speaks, it says boom, 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 written down, and they don't want to deal with the oral tradition stuff. This may sound ridiculous, but does anybody actually believe that?
I don't think so. I'm not aware of any scholars, no matter
Okay.
how conservative they may be. Even those on the far right, I think they would all, New Testament scholars at least, would acknowledge that there is an time when these stories, I mean, let's face it, the first gospel, most scholars think, is Mark. There's some good reasons for believing that Mark was written first. Now, I know some of the early church fathers, there are seven of them that say Matthew was, well, five of them that say Matthew was written first. But most of those, plus a few others, say that Matthew was written in Hebrew, and we don't have Hebrew Matthew. We have Greek Matthew. And even evangelical scholars who specialize in Greek, people like Dan Wallace and D.A. Carson will tell you that the Greek Matthew today is not translation Greek. It was originally written in Greek. So if there was a Hebrew Matthew that was written first, it's been lost, and it's not the Matthew that we have in our New Testament.
Right.
So the Mark we have was probably written first. And most scholars, I had a student at HBU who did his master's thesis on this. He surveyed over 200 critical scholars since 1965 who wrote on the topic. And he found that the majority of scholars, New Testament scholars writing on this since 1965, say that Mark was written sometime between 20 and 40 years after Jesus died. So somewhere between the years 50 and 70. So even if you take the earliest of that and go, say, 50, you're looking at about 20 years that elapsed between when Jesus died and when the first gospel was written. So how do we know what happened? Well, because oral history and oral tradition is being passed around by the apostles. It's being formulated. It's being passed around in a very controlled manner during that time. And then by the time the Gospels are written, you have eyewitnesses. You have those who knew the eyewitnesses, and you have this oral tradition that is present, and that's what the Gospels are comprised of.
So, okay, so how important is it to know precisely who wrote the four Gospels? Now, I would say most people say in churches or else devotional life, you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This doesn't come up in you're not laying up at night going, God, am I 99% certain Matthew wrote Matthew? Am I 89? I mean, you're not really worried about it. You just say, hey, Matthew wrote Matthew, John wrote John, Luke wrote Luke, Mark wrote Mark. And then, of course, Ehrman argues his main argument still the Gospels are written anonymously. But I mean, how important is this for us to know who wrote them versus it being true and accurate? Like, what's the relationship? Like, you have to know,
Yeah, that's a good question.
Precisely.
Well, I think it is important. It's not a deal breaker if some of the Gospels weren't written by their traditional authors. The chances that none of the traditional authors are correct is very small, almost zero. I would say when Ehrman and others talk about how the Gospels are anonymous, I do think they are largely correct. I think they're largely correct, but I think it is overblown. And the reason being is because, yeah, there's a lot of manuscripts out there that have the attribution of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but a lot of them don't. Take, for example, our earliest manuscript, P52, the Bodmer Papyri. That's a fragment of the Gospel of John, and it's dated somewhere between the years 100 and 150. So within 10 to 60 years after John was written, very early. It doesn't have the Gospel according to John anywhere on that manuscript. The early fragment of Mark that we have that was discovered a few years back, that's now been dated to around the year 200, perhaps a little earlier, that doesn't have the title on it. So there's a lot of manuscripts that don't have the title. And so it could very well be the case. In fact, I think it's probably the case that the Gospels were anonymous in the autographs. But here's why that doesn't bother me in the least.
Mike, I'm sorry, can you just define what you mean by anonymous? Everyone knows what we're saying. I don't assume everyone knows this.
That there's no attribution of authorship.
Okay.
In other words, there's no title. The titles that we have, the Gospel according to Matthew, Gospel according to Mark, etc., they didn't come until probably sometime in the 2nd century.
Right.
All right.
Okay.
Now, the reason I don't have a problem with the Gospels being anonymous is because I made a list of all the biographies that were written within 150 years on each side of Jesus. So within a 300-year period, with Jesus falling right in the middle, biographies written about anyone. And they're all anonymous, except one, the passing of Peregrinus by Lucian of Samosata in the middle of the 2nd century. All of them are anonymous. So it was standard practice for ancient biographies to be anonymous. If you look at the most popular biographer in antiquity, the most highly regarded biographer in antiquity, it's Plutarch. He wrote on the heels of John. So he's writing around the year 95, and he writes just past the year 120. And he wrote over 60 biographies, of which 48 have survived. A lot of what we know about the ancient world comes from Plutarch. He's a great writer. Every last one of his 48 biographies are anonymous. They have no title. The name Plutarch doesn't appear anywhere in those biographies. Here's a couple of more things. There's one of the best Roman historians is a guy named Sallust. He knew Julius Caesar. He's writing in the 2nd half of the 1st century BC. He writes 3 things. He writes the histories of Rome. He writes the war with Jugurtha and the war with Catiline. Okay, in fact, Quintilian, famous Roman rhetorician at the end of the 1st century, he says that Sallust was a better historian than Livy, and then one must be advanced in their studies in order to appreciate him properly. So here you have Sallust. He's a great writer. We've got 3 things that have survived. All of his writings are anonymous.
Right.
Julius Caesar wrote the commentary on the Civil War. It's entirely anonymous. In fact, Caesar refers to himself in the 3rd person throughout, just like John does in John's Gospel. So you've got Plato, anonymous. All his writings are anonymous. Porphyry, Galen, so many of them. Suetonius, it seems, is anonymous, his 12 Caesars. So it was standard for it to be anonymous. You say, well, how did the ancients know who wrote it? Well, we don't know exactly, but they knew. So these things circulated and people knew who wrote these things. I would say that the evidence we have for the traditional authorship of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is superior. In fact, it's far superior to the evidence we have that Plutarch wrote the 48 biographies that have survived. And yet you won't find any classicist out there. You'd be hard pressed to find any who would question whether Plutarch wrote those 48 biographies.
Right.
So we've got some decent evidence for the traditional authorship of all 4. And that doesn't mean that it's unimpeachable. It doesn't mean we can have absolute.
Don't use that word.
So, yeah. But the evidence we have for Mark and Luke is a lot better than what we have for Matthew and John. The evidence we have for John is probably better than what we have for Matthew. There's some sticky points with Matthew. Personally, I think Matthew was very closely involved with the composition of the gospel, but I don't think he actually wrote it.
So what does Ehrman say to that about the issue of the anonymous thing with other ancient authors? You know, what you bring up.
That's something that I don't think we've discussed it. We may have. No, we have a written debate that we did on the historical reliability of the Gospels. Anyone interested in that can go to thebestschools.org. That's a website, thebestschools.org, and just type in Ehrman Licona debate.
Right.
And that will come up, and they can read it. And there's probably something in there where he responds to that, but I don't recall if he does or if the topic came up. I'm sure it came up, but I don't.
Yeah, I've read that a long time ago. It's good. So I know you've done a lot of work on the genre of the Gospels. Only a couple more talking points here, and then I'll get to some other people. So, what about interpreting the Gospels? Like Blomberg says here in his book Historical Reliability New Testament, can we speak of, I know you know about this, can we speak of the Gospels as biographies, if by what we mean by modern Western biographies? Of course not. Jesus lived in the Middle East, not in the West, and he lived long before that modern era. It would be sheer anachronism and a monstrous injustice to value Matthew, Mark, and Luke by 21st century standards of precision, some of which they probably could never imagine. And then you did a lot of your work in one of your books using Burridge's book. You know, we talked about what the genre of the Gospels are, certain kind of biographies. So where do you think we mostly go wrong with not understanding the way the Gospels are written compared to modern biographies? Is it just precision issues mostly, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's precision issues. And that's a good quote by Blomberg. And most people, if you're listening, you need to understand who Craig Blomberg is. He's one of the most prominent evangelical gospel scholars alive today. And he's very conservative, very conservative.
Yeah, he does for us.
So for him to say that is big. You know, most others would recognize this, and it's not a problem at all. But to see Blomberg acknowledge this is big. So there is a difference between the degrees of precision that were expected between ancient biography and modern biography. Say, okay, well, can you give us an example? Yeah, here I could give you several, but let me give you a quick one. Sermon on the Mount. You've got it in Matthew and you have it in Luke. You've got many differences between them, but let me just name one of them. One of the differences is that in Matthew, it seems like it's on the summit of the mount, whereas in Luke, it's on a plain. He comes down off the mount, and it's on a plain that he gives the sermon. And so therefore, it's also called the Sermon on the Plain that we read in Luke. Well, some will say, well, are these two different sermons? No, they're the same sermon, and there's various reasons for thinking this as well. And just about every New Testament scholar I know, even the very conservative ones, would say, yeah, this is the same sermon. It's not two different sermons. So what are we to make of the difference? Is it a mount, and maybe you come halfway down the mountain, and there's a plain, and then you come all the way? No, this isn't like the Rocky Mountains or the Blue Ridge Mountains that are large. I mean, if you go to Israel, it's a mount. It's not nearly as large as, if we're talking in Galilee where this would have occurred, somewhere near Capernaum, there are no mountains, how we would talk about mountains here in the United States. They are mounts. They're big hills. So what I think is going on here is Matthew has changed the location to the top of the mount, rather than on the plain. You say, well, why would he do that? Well, most New Testament scholars who have specialized in studying Matthew have observed various themes throughout that Matthew has put together. One of those themes is not only that Jesus is the Messiah, the son of David, but also he is a type of new Moses. So whereas Moses was one who brought about and gave the law of God to the people, Jesus, as the new Moses, is the one who interprets the law of God for people. And that's why when you read in the Sermon on the Mount, he'll start like in chapter 5, I think it's around verse 21 or something. He says, "You have heard that the ancients were told, 'Thou shalt not kill, and whoever kills, murders, will be guilty before the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be guilty before the court. You have heard that it was said, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks on a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." What Jesus is doing there is interpreting the law of God. He's not setting aside, as some New Testament scholars in the past have said, he's not setting aside the law of God there and saying, I, as God, have the authority to do that, and therefore I'm given another law here. No, he's interpreting this law. He is saying, yeah, the law says don't commit adultery, but it goes beyond that. I as God and Father, we want you to be holy. And that means not only committing adultery by actually having sex with a woman who's not your wife, but also by being pure in your mind, pure in your thoughts. And so he goes on in this, and he's interpreting the law. It's not just the external, it's the internal that God has. So he is the new Moses. They say, well, Mike, that sounds all interesting and everything, but how do we know that this is the case? I can prove it because I've been to Israel twice. And several years ago, I memorized the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew's version of it. And both times when I've been in Israel, the group I was with asked me to recite the Sermon on the Mount at the spot. There were two spots. One is the traditional site of the Sermon on the Mount. There's a church there. And the other is one that's close to that, where it's up on a mount, but there's a better view because the church has like trees that go down a slope now, and you can't even go down that slope because there are trees there. So on both those places, I recited the Sermon on the Mount. You can go on my YouTube channel right now. Just go to YouTube and go to Mike Licona and then type in sermon. And you'll see the video come up, Sermon on the Mount. It's about 17 minutes long. You can recite the Sermon on the Mount in 15 to 17 minutes. And there was a slight breeze blowing. And you'll see a couple people. There were probably 30 people there in the group. You won't see them all. You'll just see some around me. And there's a gentle wind blowing. And you'll find that at times it's very difficult to hear what I'm saying. And the camera that is recording me is no more than 15, 20 feet away. So if that's going to be the case, and these people are fairly close, I can tell you that the acoustics were such at both sites that there is no conceivable way that many people would have, hundreds, perhaps thousands, would have heard me be able to say that if they're sitting on a hill. Yet that's how we traditionally think about the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is at the top, and all these people are sitting on the slope. There's no way that a lot of people are going to hear. That's bad acoustics. But if it's on a plain and people are sitting on the slope, there can be some places where it can form like an amphitheater, and you could have thousands hear you. So the Sermon on the Plain is, that's probably the location where it occurred on the plain, but Matthew relocates it so that artistically, as a portrait, he can put emphasis on Jesus as the new Moses, a portrait that he is painting of Jesus.
Now, that is something we think about all the time we read the Sermon on the Mount. That's really cool.
Yeah.
Very
And
interesting.
there's much more that can be said about this kind of stuff. Matthew does it more than the others, by the way. Matthew does it quite a bit.
That's really cool. All right, one last question. I'll take some questions. So a lot of people, as you know, complain, I know you've heard this a million times, that there should be better evidence for Jesus outside the New Testament. And of course, they'll say, you know, well, the Gospels, the New Testament is biased. I can't trust that. What do you got outside New Testament for Jesus? Something that's unbiased, completely objective, blah, 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 blah. You know, we can't trust those New Testament authors. They're just so biased. So, you know, we have sources, you know, different ones. I know you've looked at all these carefully. What ones, if you had to pick two, you think are the best ones? Some of these are stronger than others. What would be the two that you would say are the best ones that talk about something significant about Jesus?
For non-Christian sources?
Yeah, do you see the chart in front of you? Like, what about these?
I would say Josephus and Tacitus. Suetonius it's inconclusive whether he actually mentions Jesus. It's in his Life of Claudius, chapter 25, where he talks about at the instigation of Chrestus, Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome. Not only is it not spelled Christus, it's spelled Crestus, like a different name. And he said, well, maybe they mixed it up because it was in Latin and they just misspelled it, possibly. But Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome in the 40s, probably the late 40s. So is he talking about Crestus expelling because of Crestus, he expelled the Jews from Rome? Is he referring to someone else that was an instigator among the Jews that got the Emperor Claudius upset and caused the Jews to leave Rome? In fact, Claudius expelling the Jews from Rome is not only mentioned by Suetonius, it's also mentioned by Luke, and I think it's chapter 18, at the where it says Aquila and Priscilla had recently come to Pontus when Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome. Those are the only two times it's mentioned. But so Suetonius, Thallus, I don't think it's a great source. He doesn't mention Jesus. All he does, we don't even have Thallus's writings. Julius Africanus in the early 3rd century mentions Thallus, that Thallus says it's an eclipse of the sun that occurred at the crucifixion. And then he goes on, Africanus says that there was no eclipses of the sun at that point. But he's not saying that Thallus is saying this as a reason to talk about the darkness. Thallus might have been doing it, but he just says that Thallus said that there was an eclipse of the sun at that time. But he doesn't say that he's trying to explain the darkness at Jesus' crucifixion. And Julius Africanus, that portion of him has been lost. It's only preserved a couple of hundred years later by someone else, that particular text. So that's not a really good reference. Pliny does mention Jesus. Not sure about Trajan. And Trajan responds. He doesn't refute the existence of Jesus, but he doesn't necessarily confirm it. I'm not sure about Hadrian. The Talmud mentions Jesus, but
That's late.
you got 70 to 290.
Yeah,
Talmud's later than that.
Yeah, that's late.
So
this is an old chart. Forgive me.
Tully doth Jesu, that's 5th century. That's kind of late. Lucian is the middle of the 2nd century. He does mention Jesus. Bar Serapion, he does mention Jesus. Phlegon, that's a tough one. We could talk about that some more and try to unpack it, but it gets a little bit technical. I'm not sure Phlegon actually mentions Jesus.
So your best two are the first two you mentioned. Josephus.
I would say Tacitus and Josephus. Josephus mentions Jesus twice. One is in a disputed passage, but most Josephus scholars do think that Josephus does mention Jesus there. It's a matter of debate on how much of the that particular text in Josephus goes back to Josephus.
Right. But he mentions John the Baptist and
he mentions James, the brother of
James.
Jesus.
Yeah, and that's pretty reliable from what I understand. James.
Oh yeah, no, hardly anyone questions those.
Okay. All righty, good enough. So can you just give one last thing, like why you think why we shouldn't expect an abundance about Jesus outside the New Testament? Like, why do people think Jesus was they act like Jesus was a superstar? Everyone would just write all about him.
Yeah. Well, I wish we had more. I mean, sure. I wish we did have more. But I wish we had more on the Romans and the Greeks and all these other kind of figures. Let's face it, the Jews didn't really write on someone that would have been a heretic. They would have considered a heretic. The Romans aren't going to write on because they're not writing on people unless they mean a lot to Rome. The Christians didn't write much about the Roman emperors. Like, for example, it's all, aside from Luke, one mention of Caesar Augustus and one mention of Tiberius Caesar. You don't find them mentioned throughout any of the Christian literature of the 1st century. Not one of them. So, well, why don't does that mean that the evidence is terrible for Caesar Augustus and Tiberius Caesar? Well, of course not. But we
Right.
do have several non-Christian sources who mention, and they're credible sources. They mention Jesus. And really Paul says he knows the brother of Jesus named James, and he'd spoken with him. It's hard to know the brother of someone who never existed. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Right.
Just these
Right.
Jesus
Oh,
mythers have to go to such extremes. That's why they just don't have a position that's respectable among scholars today.
and that reminds me, when you get a chance, Simon Brace wants me to ask you to look at this new thing that's making the headlines in South Africa, this theory called Caesar's Messiah. The Roman, look at this, the Roman conspiracy to invent Jesus. He said it's just making headway all over the place there. I was like, I don't think we have time to go into this, but I'll tell Mike to take a look at it. He's got nothing else to do.
Yeah, it's like if the Romans are inventing that, then why are they going around and you mentioned Pliny the Younger and Trajan, right? We still have their correspondence between each other. Why is the Roman government trying to crush the Christians? Why do you have Nero who's crucifying these Christians and feeding them to wild animals, as Tacitus reports? And Tacitus calls it an evil, mischievous superstition. Okay, this is what the greatest Roman historian, Tacitus, says that Christianity is an evil, mischievous superstition. And he talks about Nero, who's executing these Christians in brutal ways in order to get rid of them. And then you've got this correspondence a few decades later between Pliny the Younger and the Emperor Trajan, where Pliny is going around knocking on doors with soldiers and saying, "We've heard you're a Christian, are you?" And if the person says yes, you got to deny Christ or we're going to haul you off here and execute you. So we're going to give you a chance to deny him, curse Christ, and save your life. Now, if the Romans invented Jesus and are perpetrating this religion, why are they trying to weed out his followers?
Right. I know.
And execute them? This is just, I don't know this theory, but
I don't
that's
either.
foolishness.
I know. He sent it. He put it on the page when I told him you're coming on. I said, ask him about this. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm sure Mike really is just really gone gun ho on this and looked all over it. Well, or studied it extensively. Oh well, who knows what's next? It's always going to be those kinds of that stuff out there. All right. Well, listen. Let's go ahead and take some questions from people for Mike. I could ask all kinds of questions, but I want to open up to people. Go ahead and ask away. Someone asked me if I recorded this. Yes, I'm recording it. Yes, I've been recording it. Okay. Who wants to talk to Mike? Go ahead, ask your questions. Shoot. Talk. Anybody?
I have a question.
Steven, he's back again. Remember Steven? Go ahead.
Outside of the New Testament, what is the earliest Christian material that talks about the worship of Jesus? I recently took a patristic class on this, and I just kind of wanted to know from another scholar, based off of what my professor said, what you would say on that.
Well, the earliest Christian material that talks about the worship of Jesus would be in Paul, right?
Well, outside the New Testament.
Okay. Well, let's see. I'd have to think about that. It's probably somewhere in the Apostolic Fathers, maybe in First Clement. I would think you'd certainly have something in Ignatius in one of his letters that he wrote on his way to being executed in Rome. But I don't know. I'd have to look at that.
I thought Pliny. Doesn't Pliny say something?
Oh, well, yeah, but he said Christian literature.
Pliny does say something that the Christians worship Jesus as if he was a god.
Right.
There's a hymn to Jesus as if he was a god.
Right.
I think that's like early 2nd century. So it's something that I believe it was from Blomberg. There's like this incantation that pagans would use, and they found this goblet with all these different names of these deities, and one of them was Jesus. And it was like supposedly a 1st century incantation goblet thing. So he said that was evidence that the pagans knew that the Christians worship Christ as God. Or some, have you heard of this, Eric or Dr. Licona?
I'm no, I'm not familiar with that. That's not been in one of the areas of study for me.
I
Okay.
just know the Pliny quote. I know that. I'm familiar with Pliny.
Now, I think, hold on a second. I think I've got a book here that might be of interest. Christ in the Early Christian Hymns. So that's probably got some stuff in it.
I have a book on it too, but I can't think of the name of it. It's somewhere.
Pre-Nicene hymns. So that would have some things in it. There's the air, yeah. Thelia. All right, so I mean, this book would have some things in it. There's a book right there that would talk about some early Christian hymns. But of course, the earliest we're going to find is going to be in the New Testament. It's going to be with Paul, like, you know, you've got the kenosis hymn in Philippians chapter 2. You got some stuff, another hymn. It's either in 1st or 2nd Timothy. There's a hymn there, so they would be early. And Paul's an apostle, you know, and he knows the other apostles and eyewitnesses. So that's going to be something that would show that the early Christians were worshiping Jesus at the earliest stages.
Stephen, do you have this book? Do you have the Hurtado book, Lord Jesus Christ? Do you have that one?
Yeah, I have that one.
Yeah, I think he talks about that at the end. He has a chapter called Doctrinal Developments. He talks about Justin and some other guys. So I don't know if you've looked into that. I think there's some stuff in there towards the end. I could be wrong. I have to go back and read it. But anyway.
I'm sure he's got some stuff in there.
Yeah. Anyway, Stephen, you want to ask anything else? I know you've got a lot of studying you're doing here in seminary.
I'll let someone else go unless there's no other questions.
Where are you going to seminary, Stephen?
Southern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Okay, cool. They've got some really good profs there.
Yeah.
If you see Jonathan Pennington, please tell him I said hi.
Yeah, sure thing.
He's a great guy.
His book, Jesus the Philosopher. How dare him write a book like that? Jesus is a philosopher. I didn't know that. Well, does anyone ask something, then or else I got Stephen ask a second question. It's up to you. Anybody? You guys are quiet tonight. Anybody? Talk. Sam, I know you want to ask something. I can see it.
Yes, I do have a question.
Okay.
I have a question from John 20:17. After the resurrection of Jesus, when Jesus said to Mary Magdalene that don't cling to me, I haven't ascended to Father yet. So what does that mean? True.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, John does some interesting things throughout his gospel. Even Blomberg acknowledges that, but virtually all Johannine scholars do. But even the conservative ones do, that John does some interesting things in his gospel. I think what he's probably doing there, you know, you got something very similar in Matthew where they're grabbing onto Jesus's feet.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about?
She's talking about John's 2017.
John
Yes.
2017. Okay.
Yeah,
Let me look at
and you can find in a Mark
Don't cling to me,
16:9
yeah.
as well. Yeah.
Okay. So John 2017, but I'm thinking that also happens in Matthew.
Yeah.
Very similar, but it's as Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, it's not mentioned who they are,
Exactly.
but the other Mary are leaving the tomb and they're running back to tell the disciples. And then you've got Jesus meets them.
Yeah.
So let's see, that's, and they grab him as well. And Jesus says something, let's see. They came up to him, took hold of his feet and worshiped him. And he told them, don't be afraid, go and tell my brothers he's going ahead to Galilee. I think what
Yes.
John is probably doing there is he's saying, has Jesus saying, you know, I haven't ascended to my Father yet. I think what Jesus is saying there is things are going to be different now. I'm going to be with you, but I'm going to be with you not in physical presence. It's going to be through my spirit, the Spirit of Christ, the Holy Spirit is going to be among you now. So we're still going to relate, but we're going to relate differently than we have already. So you're going to have to get used to that. That's how I would interpret Jesus there.
Okay.
Yeah, you'd have to
Do you
read
have
the
some
whole
other
context.
thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thanks,
anybody
everyone.
else? Any other questions? Anybody? Nobody. Wow.
I
You guys
have,
are
I have
quiet
another one,
tonight.
actually.
Okay,
If
go
no one
ahead.
else wants to ask a question. Dr. Licona, could you explain the interlocking of the New Testament, like the undesigned coincidences features that are mentioned in like the synoptics and with John?
Well, I think there's some interesting ones. I don't think, I'm not impressed by a lot of the ones that are proposed, but there are some certain ones that I do find impressive. So like, for example, when you go to, you got to remember that when the first readers are reading these gospels, it's not like, they have a whole New Testament like we do. It's like, oh, you got the Gospel of Luke, let's read it. And they're not necessarily comparing it with what Matthew or some of the other gospels are saying. So you read it and try to think about how these first readers thought about things. Okay, so you go to Luke's gospel and Jesus is before Pilate and he's on trial, and Pilate says, are you a king? And Jesus says, it is as you say, or yes, I am, in other words. And the next sentence, very next verse, Luke says that Pilate goes out and says to the Jewish leaders, I find no cause of a crime in this guy. That's like, what? If you really think about this, we're thinking, because we know what John, the longer conversation that takes place in John, that Jesus is before John, hey, are you a king? I am a king, but my kingdom is not of this world. And so Pilate knows he's no threat to them. But when you're reading it just in Luke, and Luke is writing before John, probably, we don't have the luxury of knowing this fuller conversation that is going on between Jesus and Pilate. So it's like, okay, you got to understand what's going on back then. The Romans, the Judea was a province of Rome, and Herod was he was merely a client king. And it was that way since Pompey took Jerusalem in 63 BC. And so a client king only had the powers that Rome gave him, and Rome could strip him of that power anytime they wanted. So a client king like Herod had to be approved by the Romans. You just can't come on the scene and say, I'm a king. And so when Pilate knows who the client king is, it's Herod. And so when Pilate says to him, are you a king? Yep, I am. And Pilate says, so I find no cause of a crime in this guy. Are you kidding me? If it had gone like that, Pilate would have executed him immediately. But no, it only makes sense if you have this fuller conversation that we read in John, which is independent of Luke. So that's an undesigned coincidence. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense on its own, but taken in context or consideration with a parallel independent source, then it does make sense. I find that's the most interesting one. Eric, I can't hear you.
Stephen, are you referring mostly to the work that's been done undesigned coincidence by other scholars and stuff? Is that what you're talking about?
I McGrew and some others. I've heard this argument.
That's the only place I've heard it from. I don't know anybody else.
There's a guy named J.J. Blount, Blount, B-L-O-U-N-T, who published a book on undesigned coincidences nearly 200 years ago.
Right, that's right.
I do think that Lydia McGrew's book, what is it called? I forgot what
Hidden in Plain Sight.
Hidden in Plain Sight. I think her book is an improvement over Blount's. And I think she, from what I've seen in it, she's got some good examples. I don't find them all compelling, but I think she has some good examples in there.
It'd be tough to unpack that with somebody. It takes some time. If you're with someone that does, skeptical of the Gospels, it would take a while, I think, to unpack some of those.
Yeah.
Yeah. Chris,
And I don't know how strong an argument it is. I think there was one in there where she talks about how, I think it's John who says the grass was green when you fed the 5,000. And yeah, that could be an undesigned coincidence because the Passover, you would have had green grass at that point, but you would have also had green grass some other times of the year. And the fact that just putting green grass, you have various narrative techniques that are described by Theon in his compositional textbook, where it talks about making things more artistic and elaborate and adding details so that the person feels as though they're present. And so anyone could explain that by just saying, well, yeah, that was just an added detail to make the narrative a little better. It doesn't necessarily mean that it occurred at that time. So I do find that the undesigned coincidences, although some of them are quite interesting, and just because you can provide an alternative explanation like the one I just gave, that doesn't mean that alternative explanation is correct any more than the undesigned coincidence is correct. I just think we have to be careful. I think it's an interesting argument. I just don't think it's anywhere near being the strongest argument we have.
Chris, you want to ask something? Chris. Well, my friend Chris, he said he's going to ask something. Now he's vanished. How about that? Thanks
I
a
have
lot.
a question, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead, Travis.
Yeah.
Hey, Eric, I'm sorry. I think Chris was trying to say something.
I'm sorry, Travis. Hold on. Chris, are you going to say something? You there? Okay, Travis, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No worries. Yeah, so Dr. Licona, I just want to ask you, what do you think is one of the biggest problems you see in popular level apologetics for the New Testament? And what would be a way to improve on that?
That's a good question.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know. I'd have to think about that a little bit. I think some things where I'm hesitating here. I've got an idea, but I don't. If I say it, I'm going to give away who the person is, and I just don't want to do that. But I would think that there are certain things in New Testament studies that is known by even second-year theology students in grad school that if some Christian apologists knew some of these things, they wouldn't make some of the claims that they're making out there. I don't want to get into specifics because I just don't want to disrespect the person I'm thinking of right now. But yeah, I'll just stop there. I'm sorry, Travis.
Yeah. Well, would you say, Mike, just to build on Travis, are you saying that sometimes maybe we just repeat popular level arguments that we don't study well enough and we don't look into it, we just kind of repeat it, and that kind of gets us in trouble sometimes? We don't really, look into it and see if is that really a good argument, or am I just going to repeat what that person says?
It could be. I just think that I used to make mistakes in the past. Like one mistake I made 21 years ago. I was responding to Acharya S., who had a book out. She was a mythicist. She had a book out, The Christ Conspiracy, the Greatest Story Ever Sold. And she was one of the first of the more recent Christ mythicists. And so she was talking about 300 to 400,000 discrepancies in the manuscripts. And I said, well, you got these manuscript families, and if there's one error and it's repeated throughout those manuscripts throughout 10,000 manuscripts, well, then that counts as 10,000 errors when it's just one, really. And that was wrong. That's not what they're talking about in that way. So I was wrong there. So we just have to learn some of these things more. And the more we learn in a particular field, the less likely we are to make mistakes. I don't really speak on science anymore. I used to speak on intelligent design. Before I got into my doctoral work, I did apologetics on more of a general. I was a generalist. And so I like to speak on things like intelligent design and all that. I wouldn't do that now. I don't feel confident. Now, if I'd read up on some of the stuff, I might, but I just haven't spent any time over the last probably 20 years. I haven't read anything on intelligent design because I've been so focused on in my field. But I think unless you're really reading the literature in that particular field, you can make some mistakes, some egregious errors, embarrassing errors, some howlers. And I want to avoid those. We're all going to make mistakes. Even the best scholars are going to make mistakes, but I want to minimize that.
Yeah, I remember your older books. You mentioned some intelligent design stuff and that Case for the Resurrection with Gary. And now I notice you kind of ditched all that stuff, mostly just history in your field now. So, I've seen it change. So, but it's not a bad thing.
Because I think intelligent design is a wonderful thing. It's not my lane. And there are better people out there doing it.
You're the same as Steve Meyer. You knew that. Chris, go ahead with your question now. Chris, go ahead. You go. I'm looking at you, Chris. What is it? He can't hear me? I don't know. Is he muted? There. No, can't hear you. I don't know what's going on. You're muting yourself and unmuting yourself. Unmute yourself one more time. Try it again. And Mike, Chris, who I'm talking about. You see him. I just can't. Chris Van Allsburg, if he would unmute himself.
Oh.
Something's wrong with his mute. Now he muted himself again. Oh, well. I don't know what's going on. Right in the chat room. Right in the chat room. Then we'll answer it that way. Okay, he's typing it. All right. In the meantime, as he's typing his chat, we have one question here. Why do we read about the curtain torn from top down, the earthquake and the graves being open and crucifixion only? Matthew's account was perhaps hyperbole. Mike doesn't know anything about that. Go ahead, Mike.
Well, some of it's reported in Mark and Luke as well, right? So the temple curtain, I think in Luke, it tears before Jesus died. In Matthew, it's after he died. And we find the earthquake and we find darkness in there as well. In Matthew, you do have some additional portents. You have like the rock split. You might even have the earthquake in Matthew, just in Matthew. I think that's just in Matthew. I think it's just the darkness and the temple veil splitting in Mark and Luke. But in Matthew, you've got an earthquake, the rocks splitting, the tombs are opened, and many of the saints are raised. And it says after the resurrection, they come out and go into the holy city and appear to others. And this has been a verse over which there's been a lot of contention. I mean, even Origen in the 3rd century said they didn't go into Jerusalem. It was referring to the holy city. Nobody here on earth actually saw them. So that's one thing, which would mean that there may not have been any testimonies at that point of people who had actually seen them, and people were questioning the account at that point. I think what's going on here, and I've provided reasons for this in my writings. If you don't have my large book on the resurrection of Jesus, you can go to my website, risenjesus.com, type in virtual roundtable, and you can read a little bit about it there, whereas there's 6 of us, I believe, who have a discussion on this. And I give reasons from the ancient literature, both Jewish and Greco-Roman literature, where I think what's going on here are things that we would call portents. Things like today you might say 9/11 was an earth-shaking event. If you were to say that, you don't actually mean to suggest that there was an earthquake going on. But back then, they would say things like, at the assassination of Caesar, there was an eclipse of the sun, there was a comet, Virgil, who's writing poetry on this, he says that streams stopped flowing. Black intestines were seen outside of cattle. Fighting was seen in the heavens. Mount Etna erupted. Pale phantoms were seen walking around at sunset. You've got Cassius Dio, who talks about when I think it's Caesar went into Egypt, that a lot of these things, a comet, darkness, ghosts were seen. The doors to the temple of Jupiter, which took many men to opened by themselves. Josephus reports that just before the temple was destroyed in the year 70, a comet was seen. Fighting was seen in the heavens. There were voices heard in the temple saying, "We are leaving this place." A cow gave birth to a lamb in the temple. The temple gates, which took more than 20 men to opened by themselves. You see that there's like several kind of parallels here in this literature. And so I think Matthew has given us kind of this. He's given us these kind of added, we don't really, to say that 9/11 was an earth-shaking event may be the closest thing that we have to this today, but we really don't give these kind of portents like they did back then. It was common in the ancient literature to do these things, to add these things to emphasize either the significance, the cosmic, or even divine significance of an event. So I think what's my opinion, I wouldn't die for this opinion, but I'm inclined to think that Matthew was doing just like Josephus and many Greco-Roman authors were doing when Caesar died, was he added some of these portents in order to emphasize that they had killed the Son of God. There are some theological problems with thinking that these things actually occurred. I'm talking about the saints being raised here. So it's like, okay, if they rose from the dead when Jesus died, it says they were resurrected when Jesus died, but they didn't come out and walk into Jerusalem until after he rose on Sunday. So Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:20 that Christ is the first fruits of the dead. So he's the first to be raised with the resurrection body. So if Matthew say these saints were they raised in a resurrection body or just like Lazarus? Well, if they're raised in a resurrection body, Matthew contradicts Paul. Say, okay, well, maybe they're raised in they're just resuscitated, revivified, brought back in the same body like what Lazarus did. Well, then they're raised around 3 p.m. on Friday, but they don't come out until at least 40 hours later, Sunday morning, and then they're walking around in the city. So now we're talking even later, they're homeless. They haven't had anything to eat or drink for more than a day and a half. So they got to be hungry and thirsty. They got no place to live. They probably have some real interesting stories. Why is it we don't hear about these people anymore? What happened to them? Did they get some food? Were they taken up to heaven afterward? I think either way, you've got some questions you need to answer. And so I think it's more plausible to look at and say, since portents were being used at that time, and they were being used by Jews. In fact, we find it in the New Testament at Pentecost in chapter 2 of Acts, where they're speaking in tongues. And Peter gets up and he says, you think that we're filled with new wine? He says, no, this is what Joel the prophet spoke about, how young men will have visions, old men will have dreams. And then later on in the sermon, he says to call on the name of the Lord. Today's the day of salvation. Well, Joel chapter 2 talks about old men having dreams, young men having visions, that the sun will go dark, the moon will turn to blood, and you call on the name of the Lord, you'll be saved. So it's obvious that Peter thinks that Joel 2 has taken place, but yet the sun didn't go dark, the moon didn't turn to blood, the stars didn't fall out of the sky. This is apocalyptic imagery. It's poetic effects, portents that are added in order to emphasize the divine significance of what was happening at Pentecost. It wasn't meant to be interpreted in a literal sense. I don't think Josephus meant for his readers to interpret really think that a cow gave birth to a lamb, or that fighting was seen in the heavens, or that the doors of the temple, which took 20 men to open by themselves. Again, we're finding parallels of this in the Greco-Roman literature as well. This is just something that was common for them to add back then. And I think that's kind of what Matthew is doing here when he talks about the saints being raised in the earthquake.
It's a tough passage, and there's been a lot of debate, no doubt. So we know that, good grief. So Chris has this question in the chat room, Mike. Here's his question. Why did the gospel writers wait so long to write the gospels? Also, is there any merit to the notion the New Testament was written prior to 70 AD because of the destruction of the temple? So first of all, why did they wait so long to write the gospels? Of course, we already talked about oral tradition, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I think from Paul's letters, it's pretty obvious that a lot of the Christians believed that Jesus was coming back in their life during their lifetime. Paul did, it seemed. In 1 Corinthians, he believed Christ was coming back during his lifetime. I think 1 Thessalonians, perhaps the earliest piece of literature in our New Testament, written in the late 40s. I think Paul thinks that Christ was coming back during his lifetime. And then by the time you get to a little past the mid 50s, Paul is thinking, he's probably not coming back in my lifetime. And he kind of changes on that some. But even in Thessalonians, the Thessalonian correspondence, Paul has to make that statement. If a man doesn't eat or work, he shouldn't eat. And people were just not working anymore because they thought Christ was coming back any day. So if you've got the apostles that are going around and they're preaching, they're just actively out there proclaiming the teachings of Jesus, and you think he's coming back anytime, why do you feel a need to write something? And by the way, only 10% of the people back then could even read. Only about 5% could read and write. So most people wouldn't have been able to read anyway. So I think it's as some of the apostles started to die off and they were recognizing, hey, you know what? We need to get this stuff in writing because Christ may be tarrying for a while. That's when they started writing these gospels. I think that's what you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke that are writing fairly close to one another. And then John later on, he's been marinating the stuff, these teachings of Jesus. He was Jesus' closest disciple. He's not going to repeat a lot of the same stuff that's already in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And he's writing, like I said earlier, John's doing some interesting things. You've got Paul Anderson, who's evangelical. He calls John a theological paraphrase. You have F.F. Bruce, no less than F.F. Bruce, who is very conservative. And he says, John is an expanded paraphrase, a translation of the freest kind, and a transposition into another key. So a lot of scholars would say that John is preserving the voice of Jesus, not the exact words of Jesus.
There you are.
Yeah. Hey, Chris.
There he is. Brad Pitt. He's always around.
Ipsissima vox versus ipsissima
Verba.
what's
Verba.
that? Verba.
Ipsissima verba.
Yeah, that's right. All right. Yeah, I like that answer, but it still seems weird that the apostles would get something so significant like that wrong. It's just, I don't hope, please don't think I'm being critical of you in that answer. I'm just saying, for me, that just seems weird that they would get something like the second coming so wrong. I don't know. It just seems strange to me that.
Yeah, that's Chris. That's something of which I think we all have to wrestle with. The fact is that in Mark, Jesus says no one knows the time. They ask him when he's going to return. He says no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. So Jesus didn't know the time of his coming. So remember, the gospel authors are recording the gist of what they remember Jesus saying. And Jesus probably did not speak in precise terms when it came to this. And so there was a vagueness, some ambiguity in his wording that many interpreted as Jesus coming back very quickly. But because Jesus didn't know, he probably spoke in vague terms. Probably one of the main reasons why they didn't expect his resurrection on Sunday morning. He said he was going to rise soon. And the 3 days, when he said he was going to rise 3 days later, that's a figure of speech, meaning a short period of time. But that short period of time could have been a few years in their eyes. So when he actually did rise from the dead a day and a half later, they were confused. They weren't expecting it. And they were thinking he was going to come back with the general resurrection, not only his own resurrection, but the resurrection of others. And since the parousia, the second coming, hadn't happened, then they weren't thinking about Jesus's resurrection being separate. So Jesus probably spoke in somewhat vague terms, and that's why there was confusion there. He probably spoke in some vague terms when it came to a second coming. Some interpreted that as it was going to be in their lifetimes, Paul at first. And it was only later that they realized this probably isn't going to happen this way. We misinterpreted Jesus.
Well, so yeah, I think in congruence with that, Paul does say in a couple places, Colossians 1:21, I think it is, maybe 19. He says, I think maybe in Romans, that the gospel has been preached to the entire world.
Right. Well, that would mean the
known Roman Empire.
Exactly.
But for them, they're like, hey, let's get it out and then he'll come. And maybe they didn't realize Jesus meant the whole planet. So my second question is, so guys like Richard Bauckham, I think, I've got his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, underneath my laptop here. I'm using it as a stand.
You have the second edition?
How awful is that? Yeah, second edition.
The second edition is definitely worth the price of the book.
Well, I got it for free because I told Ehrman's I'd read a book review on it, but then I didn't, and I emailed them, told them I felt guilty, and they said, don't worry about it. So, but anyway, what do you think about the idea that the whole New Testament was written prior to AD 70 because the destruction of the temple is not mentioned?
Yeah, I think it's possible. You had John A.T. Robinson who said that, I think, back in the 70s. I haven't really spent a lot of time on that. So what I would say to that, Chris, is you've got strong conservatives like a Craig Keener, and then another strong evangelical, Ben Witherington. Both of them have written commentaries on Acts. And of course, Craig Keener's written the mother of all Acts commentaries.
No.
Yeah.
And again, these are strong evangelicals. They haven't, and they've done more work on Acts than, especially Keener, than anyone I know. Keener's probably done more than anyone in the history of the world on Acts. And neither of them are convinced by that argument, even though you think they'd have no reason not to be. I think Witherington says something along the lines of, Acts is not a biography. It is a history of the first 3 decades of the church. It is not concerned with the temple destroying. It's just taking you up to the time of Paul. So, and he could be right. I forgot what Keener says. Keener thinks that Acts was written around the year 70, maybe a little bit later, and Luke just a little bit before that. So, Keener doesn't necessarily find it that compelling. You'd have to read their books to see exactly why, but I just would look at that and say, well, these guys that would have every reason to be persuaded by that aren't persuaded by that argument, having studied extensively the matter of the dating of Acts and Luke's gospel. So that's why I reserve judgment on that. I just look at that. I say, these guys have studied that particular topic a lot more than me. They're not persuaded by it. They must have good reasons for their position. And until I have spent the time to look at it, I'm just going to say, hey, it's possible, but they may not have written it all before the year 70.
So now I'm understanding your reticence regarding general or popular level apologetics books when it comes to the reliability of the Gospels and everything.
Because they say that argument every single one of them.
Yep. Yeah. They
Pretty
give it all.
much.
Yeah, they do give that a lot. I just, when you look at literature, there are just very few New Testament scholars who are going to hold that position today. And again, you have to read the commentaries on it to see what their arguments are. I just haven't taken the time to do it. There's so many things. Gosh, when I was in college, I thought someone with a PhD in theology just knew all the answers to the Bible. And now I come to understand that having a PhD in New Testament, you're just scratching the surface on the things that you can study in the New Testament. You can spend an entire career just studying resurrection and never being able to get out of it into anything else.
Could you explain the thing about head coverings to us real quick?
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's good. Yeah. Well, that's why I always start with Paul before I start the Gospels. He's the earliest. All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. We passed 9 o'clock, 9:03, and then Mike's got to go to bed and he's got things to do. He's got to get on the treadmill before he goes to bed and everything. I know.
No, but I do have to get up at 4:30 tomorrow morning.
I'm just joking. Anyway, well, listen, thanks so much for coming on again, Mike. We appreciate your time. We know you're very busy. I will send you out the clip from this and keep up the great work. And, we'll look forward to what book, by the way, last question, is a book you're writing right now? Another one, a new one, anything? You have time?
Yes, I'm in the middle of writing popular level, less technical treatment of gospel differences.
Oh, okay.
So I
Okay,
hope to
that's
have
right, you
that
told
done
me.
by early summer, by first part of June, and then hopefully that will be out sometime either next summer of 2022, or fall of 2022.
Is Oxford publishing that again?
They have expressed interest in it, but I don't think I'm going to put it with them. It's not going to be an academic book. It's really going to present things. It's for people with a high view of Scripture, folks like myself and others who have a high view of Scripture. The Oxford book, the academic book that I did that was published 4 years ago, was made for scholars and serious gospel students. It's very technical, and I tried to bracket my own personal biases and Christian convictions and just tell the facts. In this one, I'm bringing my Christian convictions into it, my high view of Scripture into it. And yeah, I give the facts, I give the details, but I also wrap it up with how do we reconcile all this stuff with our view of Scripture, with divine inspiration and biblical inerrancy.
Nobody
and
cares
so
about that. Yeah.
It's going to be something that is very friendly for use by small groups as well.
Okay, great. We'll look forward to it. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming. We appreciate it. And we'll follow up with you by email. But everyone, thanks for coming. And we have on Christopher Yu on next week, also information about that. So once again, thanks for everyone coming tonight. Mike, bless you, and God bless risen Jesus. And I'll have you back to the campus when COVID breaks.
That'd be fun, Eric. And listen, man, thanks for your ministry. I really appreciate your ministry and all that you've done. I've seen you over the years. We've become friends and talking and stuff. And I love you, man. Respect what you're doing. And you guys that are in this group here, you got a great leader. So
let me tell you something. I've had some great students, quality students throughout the years. One of the biggest blessings, as you know, from doing teaching or campus ministry is the students you run into. So that's the coolest thing. So I'm really blessed. And thank you for it. I couldn't do it myself. No way. Well, thanks again. And blessings to you. And I look forward to everything you're going to see you doing over the next year. So may you be healthy. Okay, everyone. I'll see you next week. God bless you all.
see you, Chris.
Take care. Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, Licona.